We are really excited to talk through the interview process tonight with all of you, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to send them to Emily Peer. She is ready and waiting for all of your questions there. You can send them through the chat or the Q&A. And then if you have additional questions that don't get answered throughout the session, you can send them to kearneycareers.ug@kearney.com. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Urvi to get us started.
Thanks, Lauren. If you could go to the next page, I just want to show the people here, the brilliant panel that we have. So welcome all. We're so excited to share the overview of the interview process with you all. A part of this discussion is going to be Drive, which is going to be led by me, and then Trey, Herman, and Kayla are going to share their interesting perspectives as well. So a little bit about me. I'm a manager based out of our New York office. I started working with Kearney back in 2013 in the India office, worked there for 4 years, moved to States for my MBA from Northwestern Kellogg, and then been working with the New York office ever since. So it's been a while since I have interviewed myself. So I'll be sharing more perspectives of the interviews that I have taken over the years, but so hence I get the dry part. But I'll hand it over to Trey and others to introduce themselves, and then we can get into the content.
Hi, everyone. I'm Trey. I am a business analyst out of the Chicago office. I interned with Kearney as a BA, what is now 3 summers ago, which I can't believe, and rejoined the firm in October, this past October, so just under a year back with the firm. I graduated from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and so I went through the interview process as an intern candidate, and so that was a really cool opportunity, and just really excited to be a part of this panel today and answer some questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Herman. I'm currently a business analyst out of our Toronto office. I joined about a year ago now full-time, but also interned in 2019, the summer prior as well. So currently in the general practice, but my work to this point has primarily been in consumer retail, health, and transportation. Yep, I can pass it off to Kayla.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kayla. I am a senior business analyst out of the Chicago office. I joined the firm 2 years ago in the New York office and recently moved and transferred to Chicago. I'm also in the general practice, but like Herman, have worked kind of across a couple different industries, including health, consumer retail, and manufacturing. So happy to kind of answer how that fits into the interview process as well. And yeah, I came through as a full-time hire, so have that perspective as well.
Awesome. Thanks, team. All right, to get us started, what we have for you as an agenda for today, we would give you an overview of the interview process. So what are the different things that we're looking at, what are the different rounds, and what are the formats that we would be asking for in those rounds. And then we would get into the details of each format type. So we'll start with giving you a brief about the behavior interview, and then the second half of this would focus more on the case interview. What is the approach? What are the expectations? And we'll share some examples from our own perspective, from our own experience so far. So getting right into this, when in an interview, there are 3 core pillars that we are looking for. So there is the behavior interview and there are the case interviews. These 2 are the more explicit form of the consulting interview, but throughout we are also looking for examples of how you interact and also examples of how you're taking care of your own experience, work experience for some, the college experience for some, like, exact whatever has been your life experiences, how do you bring that into the client interactions as well. So getting into the details of how does this look like from a format type in a interview, we are having it across 2 rounds. The first round is going to have the behavioral part and the case interview. And the second round is going to be the same, but we're going to have another case interview, 45-minute session along with it. So what does a behavior interview entail? Think of this as a communication that you, like a normal conversation that you are having on a daily workplace level. When you meet somebody new, how are you going to tell them about your past behavior or what you've done? That is what the behavior interview is all about. Usually the format that we're looking for is having some kind of story behind it. So you need to have a format, and I'll let Trey explain to you or give you an example of how does that look like. But essentially think of it as you describing the situation and giving some context just so that we understand what is it that you want to share. But it's more about what you did in that situation that you were in, and how did that help solve the problem, or how did that help kind of shape the experience going forward. So think of this not as like you have to follow a structure, but think of this more as like this is that one very important tool that you have to leave behind a brand for yourself. It's totally okay to be the person who somebody would remember as this was the person who failed a vendor negotiation, than being a person who somebody does not remember at all. So think of this as just the one story that you can tell. Trey, anything to add from your side here?
Yeah, I think that the behavioral interview is just so important because it's such a great opportunity to stand out and show a side of yourself that's a little harder to come out in the case interview. So one thing I think that's really big here, right, is that this is a great opportunity to show off your attitude. As a business analyst, I've received constant feedback, both as an intern and full-time, that one of the most important traits that you can have to be successful is your attitude, right? Because everyone can build skills, and not everyone comes in at the same level, but unless you have the right attitude, you're not going to grow as a consultant. And so, behavioral interview is a really great opportunity to show off your attitude, and also your personal skills, which is another thing that is really important in consulting. We're working all day with both your team and potentially with clients interacting. And it's very clear that to drive the best results, you need to get along with people. And this is another opportunity to show that you're a person, that you're, personable and have the right attitude for the job. So this SAO scenario, it's as I already said, you shouldn't only answer questions in this format. There'll also be a little back and forth. You need to be responsive to the kind of questions you're receiving, but this is a good way to sort of keep you on track. And it also emphasizes the action, right? So you don't want to use the behavioral interview as just a chance to talk about accomplishments. You want to talk about what traits about yourself allowed you to achieve those accomplishments. So showing a chance where you were creative or you showed leadership, and how that led to a result, not just getting to the final result. So that's a good way to kind of stay focused, is to use this scenario action outcome guideline, but also be prepared to answer questions outside of this framework. We want to go to the next slide. So generally there's going to be three types of questions. The first one is the introduction, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's really just a tell me about yourself kind of answer, and you want to check off all the basics you want to get to. But what I think is really important here is this is your opportunity to talk about not necessarily why you're right for Kearney, but why Kearney's right for you, right? So what is it about your education or your job opportunities thus far that have made you realize that you want to be a consultant and that this is something you're interested in? This is a really good opportunity to connect those to your resume and sort of bring it to life, I would say. Another type of question is the past experiences. So that's going to be the tell me about a time. And here, the best advice that I can give is yes, don't ramble, keep it focused. You definitely want to leverage the framework that we saw in the previous slide. But the biggest thing here is, you should have a prepared in your mind some stories, and you don't need a story for every single possible question that could be asked, right? You have a set of stories that represent yourself well, and those can be weaved to answer multiple questions. But one thing that's important is you still need to answer the question, right? You shouldn't have a pre-made story that you recite back that's like loosely tied to the question. Make sure you address the question. You can, obviously you want to come prepared, but you also want to show that you're listening to the question and actively trying to answer it, and not just reciting back something that you remembered. And once again, in these types of questions, you really want to focus on how you got to the outcome, not just necessarily what the outcome was. And then lastly, you're going to have personality questions. And so here, as you can see in the tips, I think these are really great. So ask for a few seconds if needed. This is something that I took advantage of throughout my entire interview process. It can seem like a little unnatural, maybe awkward, but I really can't recommend it enough because it does a couple of things. Obviously, it helps you collect yourself and think through what you want to say, but it also shows that you're not only prepared, but you're also being thoughtful, right? It's an opportunity to show that you didn't just come with a remembered list that you recite back. You actually listened to the question and you thought about it, and it's a really good chance to kind of show that you can think a little bit outside of the box by asking for time, because you shouldn't have an answer immediately. And lastly, it's an opportunity to be original and authentic. I think that this is really important. I know that I felt like I really got to connect with my interviewers, and it definitely helps stand out. You want to show that you have some personality, and I would say, as silly as it sounds, like remind yourself to smile and don't be afraid to laugh, acknowledge a little awkward moment, just different little things that show that you're a human that brings a lot to the table, and not just a robot. Like I said up front, this is just a really great opportunity to share with Kearney, who you are and why you're right for the position. And your personality is a big part of that. So don't be afraid to show it off.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that what Trey said, because think about this, like think of when you're preparing for a behavioral interview, you also should think about the mind space that your interviewer is going to be in. And I know it's difficult to do it, and it's also not fair to expect you to kind of go into their mind space thinking about what's good for them. But they are having 5 or 6 or like full day of interview back to back, right? And this is the chance in which you create that opportunity for yourself and also give them a breather from, like, boring back to back cases, right? This is when you share something that they might not have heard from anywhere else. This might make their day. So don't be shy in sharing and showing your personality. That's actually going to be what gets you the win. And especially at Kearney, because one thing that you'll hear most from everybody that you interact with, Kearney, is one of the best reasons, or one of the reasons we're all staying here, is because of the people. So we love the people here, and if you show us that human side of you, I think that's going to get you the win from Kearney for sure. Okay, enough about behavior. So let's get into the case interviews now. Let me start first with, why is there a case interview? So consulting is a it's a different job. It's the most difficult job to have a job description for, because the industry that you will work with is going to change. The context is going to change. You're probably going to work with a different team every 3 months. You're probably going to work with a different client. So you need to be comfortable with ambiguity. You need to have strong analytical skills to be able to kind of weed through a lot of information and come up with good inferences. And the most important thing of all of this is that you should be able to do that, keeping your poise and having a good communication skill. Why is that important? That is important because your idea is no good if you're not able to communicate it. Your skills are no good if you're not able to apply it. So case interview is exactly what you would be doing for 3 months. You just do it in 30 or 40 minutes here. And it's a great tool for us to kind of get a sneak peek into how you think about a problem. It is not so much about having the right structure, doing the math right, getting summarizing it well. It is all of that, but it's at the same time it's having that intellectual discussion. Can you and I think about a problem, even if it's 2 plus 2? Can you and I have an intellectual discussion about it? If you can convince me 2 plus 2 is 5, you'll get the job. No worry about it. It's just about the process and just making sure that you're comfortable with it. And this is an opportunity, while the other was behavioral interview is an opportunity for you to tell your story. This is an opportunity for you to tell how you think. So approach it in that way. That was more meaning of life, going into the tactics of how this actually happens. So I'm sure you're into the interview process, so you would know what exactly is a case interview. But some of you who might not and are still new to it, what do we mean by a case interview? It's kind of like a business problem. So so and so company is hiring us because they're facing profitability issues. What do we do to go and improve profitability for them? That's the case. It's going to have some facts, it's going to have some evidence, but overall it's a very overarching problem statement that we kind of peel the onion one by one. And before we, maybe Kayla or Herman, one of you can maybe walk through what are the different steps of the case process and share your experience in the way. Kayla,
Sure.
okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Arvi. So I'll kind of walk through high-level process, and then on some of the following pages, we'll go through them in a little bit more detail. But overall, kind of following this 4-section structure where you're given a problem, you have some time on your own to think through the framework, you'll get some additional data, and then you'll synthesize that and make a recommendation. So if we want to go to the next page, we can kind of dig into the upfront portions of the interview, of the case interview. So starting off with the situation and then setting up your framework, you really want to make sure you're kind of listening carefully and understanding the problem before you jump in. You can see this kind of upfront section is no more than 4 to 8 minutes. And then the bulk of the conversation is going to be in that next section in data collection and analysis. So you really have a short window to kind of make sure you're getting it all down on paper, all down in your head. And this is your kind of opportunity to share with your interviewer that you've understood the problem and you're kind of ready to jump in. And I would say that the biggest piece of advice I would give here is, I'm sure you're all practicing your frameworks and doing practice cases, but kind of be prepared for something, maybe that doesn't fit a perfect framework you've seen in a book. Not to say that will throw you a huge curveball, but kind of be prepared to adapt what you've seen and kind of make a custom solution for the problem so that, you're not just conveying to your interviewer that you've learned those, academic book taught frameworks, but you can really apply that to a specific case and problem. And then,
I'd like to,
oh, go ahead.
I like to think about frameworks as like something that you should have made enough frameworks when you come to the interview that it's something which is second habit for you. It's just so naturally comes to you that You can draw from it in an actual case interview. You are drawing from your framework as to this is what is relevant. So when you get into making your framework, going back to Trey's advice of taking that 1 or 2 minutes, when you take that 1 or 2 minutes, you're not thinking about profitability is this and this, like, it's revenue and cost. You already know that. What you're thinking about is like in this problem, how is revenue important? Is cost important? In revenue, what is important? In cost, what is important, right? So just practice enough that you're not thinking about what the framework is, you're thinking about what are the relevant things to talk about in the framework that you already have set up.
So with that said, I think the second portion of this is really around the data collection and analysis. So you really want to make sure you're kind of capturing the data well. And I know that Herman will dig into some of the note taking, but really reiterating to your interviewer that you're hearing what they're saying, you're capturing it in an organized manner, and you're kind of able to process that information. And so one example just from my interview experience is, I took the time to draw out just a quick data collection table for some of the inputs I wanted to get. And I actually kind of misheard something that I off by a 0. So let's say it was 100 and I wrote down 10. But I kind of was, tilting my paper, showing my interviewer what I had collected, and he was easily able to correct it kind of in the moment and say, oh, this is actually 10, not 100. So those simple things can kind of keep your interviewer engaged, not just that you're talking at them, but kind of saying, this is what I heard, here's how I collected it, and kind of just being really structured and organized about that. And I think back to what we were saying from the behavioral portion is they really want to see, how would you do this in a client situation? So being really organized, how you document data that you get from a client, and just kind of doing a mini version of that in the case interview. And then again, just kind of making sure that the path of analysis that you're going down really answers the problem that you heard in the beginning part of the interview. So I think that kind of covers this portion. And then recommendations on the next slide, just overall.
Before we go there, Kayla, just few things that I think people fall into in this step of data collection and analysis. First, Kayla's point on keeping things organized, right? The idea is not for your paper to look beautiful, right? It's fine. I have a very bad handwriting. I come from a family of doctors and they are like, I just can't understand what you write. But the idea is use the paper. Like, we know there is use paper, use iPads, whatever you do to scribble onto things, ensure that you're not writing everything on top of each other so that your math is organized. It's very easy it's fine if you want to write like 9 zeros. It's completely fine. Some people are visual, some people are not. Whatever works for you, use those papers to kind of ensure that you have things in a tabular form. You're taking notes in the side of what you want to summarize and what you want to do next. And then the second thing that people usually they kind of fall back into this is that they stop engaging. They get so caught up in the math, they get so caught up in like, okay, what am I supposed to do next, that they forget that the interviewer is there to help you. So if the interviewer is giving you hints that this is the place you should look into, catch on to those hints, because trust me, it's in the interviewer's benefit as well for you to solve the case. So you're going to be working together with them. Think of them as a team member and don't think of them as an interviewer, especially in this step.
Thanks, Irvi. And I think one thing you hit on that feeds right into recommendations is really keeping notes of those key points that you find in your data collection analysis. So kind of setting up your page or your screen to have your analysis on kind of the majority of the page, but also having room for notes and key points on the recommendations portion. So kind of when you're given, 1 to 2 minutes to synthesize your findings, taking that time to think it through, but also really it should be a little bit more straightforward because you've been taking good notes and highlighting those key points throughout. So not so much of rethinking about things, but really just packaging the analysis that you've done and coming up with a good summary of that. And I think one additional tip I would have is also just kind of highlighting those risks and being realistic. So a lot of Kearney interviewers actually use real cases from their clients. So they might adapt it a little bit, but they are drawing off of real experiences. So I think as much as you can identify risks and kind of dig into that, I think that would be appreciated by an interviewer, because it shows you're kind of thinking beyond just the information in front of you, but really some real client situations and how this might play out in the real world. And with that, I think Herman will go through some of the frameworks and kind of some additional tips on note taking.
Awesome, appreciate it, Kayla. I'm gonna apologize in advance if you hear the distant cries of a baby in the background. That's just my niece, so bear with me. Thanks. Yep. So as Kayla mentioned, the initial framework for the problem is really key and ultimately creates your foundation for success. Ideally, it's this sort of roadmap that you've mapped out at the beginning that you can kind of continue to reference throughout the case, and helps you, gives you guidance in terms of how to drive the case forward. It's also essentially the initial impression, really, so for the interviewer. So it's really important from that sense as well. And for me personally, as I was prepping, and I think this is pretty common across a lot of candidates, the initial framework definitely took the longest time for me to really get my head around it. And now I know, based on everything I've said so far, it makes this section of the case sound really scary, but it really isn't. In fact, in my opinion, it's one of the best parts of consulting in my mind. On our regular engagements, part of our value as consultants is being put in new scenarios, facing new problems, but ultimately being able to decompose the problem at hand into more digestible subcomponents that can actually be tackled individually. And that's how you kind of get this tree structure that you see on the right here that we'll dive into a bit more on subsequent slides. So moving on to the next slide, perhaps, here are some specific examples of sort of out-of-the-box frameworks for different scenarios. And you'll see, obviously it's going to vary by case, whether it's an M&A versus sourcing or whatever. But I think the takeaway that I'd want you to have from this slide is that really it's the fundamentals that are identical across all these different cases and frameworks ultimately. So for example, first on the far left, you have, the ultimate question that you're trying to tackle, and that's common across all of these. Then from there, it's really just a series of decompositions, and you'll notice that each of those decompositions is as messy as possible. So, looking at the first example, if we decompose revenue growth into existing markets and new markets, essentially we've covered the entire universe right there, and so on as you kind of continue to go down the tree in that sense. Now, one thing, I'd like to kind of throw a huge red flag here and warn you about is that a lot of folks are tempted to try to memorize frameworks and, as we've kind of touched on already, kind of take some out of the box frameworks that they've seen in textbooks and use them to kind of fit the problem into it. And this is really a huge pitfall because, number one, it shows that you're not actually thinking critically about the problem. And number two, you're also probably not going to be able to address the specific client's specific problem if you're thinking in more generic terms. So it's really table stakes that you customize your framework to the problem. And as an example, let's say you're creating a framework to, understand why a restaurant's sales are declining. Let's say one of your hypotheses there is around customer service. So maybe it's around, poor customer service. It is not enough, in my view, to kind of just leave that part of the tree at customer service and kind of not, decompose it or think about it further than that. Ultimately, you want to think critically about what customer service means in the context of that specific problem, and then go from there. So, as an example, for this case, you could decompose customer experience or customer service into a customer journey that covers, the discovery of the restaurant, getting to the restaurant physically, getting seated, and then actually eating. And you'll notice that all those individual buckets are very relevant to the case, and it's something that wouldn't apply to another problem. So customer service in that instance, the way you decomposed it, does not apply to customer experience or service for like an industrials client or something like that. So that's really the idea of thinking in a very tailored way, and I just encourage you to kind of challenge yourself as you're practicing cases to really get specific wherever you can on those kind of deeper branches. And a good litmus test that I often used when I was prepping was, if you write out your framework and if you could apply kind of all those sub branches to something completely random, like let's say a shoe manufacturer, then it's probably not insightful enough, right? So customer service is a bucket, for example, that's something that you could just apply and throw around everywhere. So if you can kind of decompose that to something that's specific to the client, then that's just a huge plus and shows the interviewer that you're really thinking critically about this specific problem. And I think on the next page now, we kind of have an example of a framework structured as a hypothesis tree. And this is for this sample problem. In this case, I won't drain the slide, there's a lot on it, but I think it's useful to just walk through some of this. So, again, here, the ultimate question or issue is how can we increase sales? And you'll notice that the first cut here is kind of mathematical. So it's basically, a number of customers multiplied by sales per customer. And that's something where, if you were to multiply them, you'd get the answer that you're looking at, right? The total sales, like the ultimate question. So that's, as a kind of piece of advice, I think whenever you can break something down mathematically, like with a formula, it's really helpful. It gives you instant structure, and it's probably one of the easiest ways to kind of decompose things in that sense. One thing I want to call out, without kind of getting into too, yeah, sorry, Ruby, go ahead.
Just quick time check. We want to ensure that we have enough time remaining for Q&A as well. So maybe we wrap this up in like a minute and then move on to Q&A.
Yep, for sure. There's just one page left after this. Yeah, so I think just the last thing I wanted to say on this page was just, you don't have to actually write down your framework in this level of detail. Personally, I would try to go to kind of that, hypothesis tranche. And then after that, maybe just jot down a couple of those points in your own language, just quick jots. But, just being able to speak to those questions as opposed to writing them down will be helpful as you're kind of writing out your framework. And then finally, on the last page, Kayla already touched on this, in terms of the importance of note-taking. Just wanted to emphasize again, it's really key. Case interviews, they can contain a lot of information. They tend to move very quickly, and you'll be surprised. It's shockingly easy to forget, certain important takeaways or case facts, even if you've been like crushing the case and grinding through the analysis, doing everything great, right? So I think just a couple of tactical tips here. I recommend you to be very liberal with your paper usage. I would go through like 6 to 8 pages, I'd say, on like the average case. I would write really large so that you're not, wasting time straining your eyes trying to find things on the page. And I think a last piece of advice here would be, you can almost structure your pages so that it's 1 page per analysis, and then on each page, when you have a big takeaway or a big important number, you can kind of box it or star it. That way, when you're at the end in terms of the final recommendation, it's really easy to just flip through your pages quickly and kind of just like come up with a recommendation because you're just stringing together those boxed answers and things like that. So I went through that really rapid fire because I know we're tight on time, but I think we're going to shift towards Q&A now. So if you have any follow-ups, please feel free to ask questions in the chat.
Perfect. So we do have some questions. I'll ask this first one and send it, Kayla, your way, and then I'll try to take down the pages so we can see all of your smiling faces a little bit bigger here. But Kayla, I'm taking a look at the tips and I'm wondering, what is it that separates or is different in Kearney's interview process from others?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren, and whoever asked the question. One thing I'll say what differentiates Kearney, and I know this might kind of seem like a typical answer, but it really is about the people interaction. So as Irvi showed on the page with the 3 pillars, at least from my experiences, I've never really seen another firm kind of go 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But I think those people interactions are really so important. And, interviewers want to see that this person that they're interviewing would be kind of ready to be a member of their team. And I think a lot of that comes down to the people interactions. So I think that's really unique about Kearney. And I think just from my experience at the firm, it's been something that I've noticed is, everyone who joins a team has that can-do attitude, like Trey said, and just really great teammates, which comes through in the interview process.
Perfect. Thanks, Kayla. Herman, I'll send this next one over to you. Is Kearney's interview approach holistic? In other words, if I'm weaker in casing, can I make up for it with strong behavioral and experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and definitely something that's on a lot of candidates' minds. And I'd say overall, it's important that you show strengths across the board. Just kind of basic competency, because all of it really is important to the actual craft of consulting on the day-to-day. So you should never just kind of focus on one area, ignore the rest, or anything like that. That being said, beyond showing just solid competency across the board, we do love to see spikes in candidates, as it's something that really makes you stand out in our memory. And as Irvi mentioned at the beginning, it just helps kind of build your brand, and it helps you kind of stick out in the long list of candidates on a sheet of paper. So if you feel you have particularly strong prior internship experiences or great stories of, say, overcoming adversity, that will absolutely be a huge plus when paired with solid casing and being solid on those other areas. So in your prep, definitely bring those spikes to the table, but also make sure you're prepping across the board and bringing your best self in all those different areas.
Perfect. Thank you. Trey, this one's coming to you. To my understanding, case studies are used in practically all consulting interviews. How does a summer intern interview differ from an interview for a full-time interview, for example?
Yes, good question. This is an easy one. So it's the same process. I think one of the coolest things about my experience as a Kearney intern is that the internship very much mirrors full-time. They have a great summer curated for you, but you're treated like a full-time employee, and so the interview process reflects that.
Perfect. Thank you. Irvi, how quant heavy are Kearney cases?
Interesting. So I think generally, just to answer the question directly, generally our cases are quant heavy, but all cases that we give in our interview process would have some qualitative aspect and some quantitative aspect, right? So things about how do we think through what are the different parameters that can impact growth, what are the different ways, what are the different costs that a retail company can have. All of these are kind of the qualitative aspect of the case. And the quantitative aspect is then kind of digging deeper into, okay, if we have to calculate how are we going to break even, how do we do that? Analytics is very important. That's what the client is paying us for. So it is important for us to test that. It is not expected for you to do complex math, but it is more about, are we able to think about the right metrics? Are we able to think about the right things? Not about the right math. We all use calculators in the real life, so it's fine. And Excel.
Thanks, Irvi. These questions are coming in rapid fire, so I'm going to keep going. Kayla, this one's headed to you. Are interviews over Zoom or virtual or in person? And do you have any tips when they're virtual?
Sure. So they are on Zoom, and I don't have any tips from my personal experience over Zoom because I interviewed in the Michigan interview rooms for anyone that's familiar. But my advice would be just really communicate as much as you can. So I know there are things that might be a lot easier to show someone on a paper if they were next to you, but really try to over communicate because you are missing that physical presence. And just a tip I'll add in here is Irvi and I actually worked together for 6 months before meeting in person over COVID. And I know that, over communicating to her as a manager was really effective. And eventually you kind of get into that style. So you'll see what your interviewer responds to, but just communicate as much as possible and kind of get to know your interviewer despite being on Zoom.
Awesome. Thank you. Herman, a question for you. For a case interview, are you expecting we create a tree as large as the sales increase example, even if the case portion is only 30 to 40 minutes?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I know, what we threw on the slide there can be a little bit intimidating. Like, how do you come up with that in 2 minutes? But, that being said, no, you don't need to go, that deep or detailed. Just to give you kind of something kind of tactical to hang on to. When I was casing, I would try to do at least 2 sublevels in terms of my structure. So that means, your kind of core question, 1 level of decomposition, and then 1 more. So breaking that down again. And then what I do is, I have that written on paper, which is usually, that itself might take 45 seconds to a minute. And then as I was articulating my framework to the interviewer, I would then kind of, mention something about each bucket, like as an example of something I'd look at. So as just for example, let's say I'm looking at like the sales example, one level, like let's say my next layer, I had one bucket that was like competition, or sorry, let's say, I had a bucket that was like external market. I broke that down and I have one sub bucket there that was like competitors. As I was talking about the competitors bucket to the interviewer, I would then mention something like, competition from, let's say, app-based services like Uber Eats, which would be different from competition from other like grocers or something like that. So you don't have to write that down on paper, but I do think like as you're going through and talking about your framework, it is helpful to kind of bring a little bit of that color and something specific to the interview or to the case to life for the interviewer. Because if you just stop at competitors, that's, it's super generic. But once I get into like app-based services, now I'm thinking about the actual problem and it's something that's relevant for the client.
Yeah. Think about like frameworks as like the level 1 is you don't have to show your frameworks, I think, in the interview, right? It's more about just a structure for you. And the reason to have that, because if you go to a client and you start talking about anything and everything, you're not going to get anything. And they would not have the comfort in you that you've thought through everything. So that is why the level 1 in a structure is more about, okay, these are the different things that I'm thinking about. And your level 2 is, in this bucket, this is what I want to ask, or this is what I want to look at. So whether it's 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, don't waste your time. And if you can just think about the things and talk to it, you don't have to write down those full sentences in the structure. Nobody really cares about that.
Perfect. Trey, I've got a double header coming your way because the first one's easy. Our case is interviewer or interviewee led.
Right, so the interviewer is going to set up some of the context up front and provide the materials, and overall they'll be keeping you on track. But you definitely want to take control of the interview as the interviewee and push things forward yourself. The interviewer is a resource, so if you're really stuck, which as Kayla and I think the whole panel's mentioned, that's why it's so important to communicate. As you are leading the interview, the more information the interview has on your thought process, they can maybe help you progress, but ultimately you want to progress, you want to push the interview forward yourself and lead that.
Perfect. And the second question, which analytics tools are mostly used at Kearney?
Yeah, so by far the most used would be Excel. I saw some of the other ones in the question, SQL, Python, etc. There will be projects where those tools are used, especially maybe in our strategic operations department. But generally, Excel is the most popular one, and those other ones are definitely nice to have analytical skills, but you're going to be spending a lot of time in Excel.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because not a lot of our clients are equipped in other programming languages. So it's for us to kind of share it with them. We kind of keep things in Excel, but then at the same time, SQL is starting to get used a lot as clients are starting to use it more. So that is another good skill to have.
And just to add to that, in my experience, my very first project was actually really SQL heavy. But just for context, like my manager talked to me before the project, asked me if I was comfortable with it. So it's something that you're not going to be thrown into not knowing anything and being expected to become like a whiz in Python or something during the project.
Fantastic. Good. Well, we are about at time here. I know there were some more questions. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have additional questions that didn't get answered, feel free to send them to kearneycareers.ug@kearney.com. And thank you to all of our panelists, Urvi, Trey, Kayla, Herman. It was fantastic. And we hope you all have a great night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.